We made it to Bowling Green. This is the oldest fence in New York City, and this is where Washington's troops marched. Oh, that lady's taking pictures. I'm here at a place called City Hall Park in Manhattan because on July 9th, 1776, a guy you may have heard of named George Washington. Imagine for a second you're an American soldier, you've been recruited into this new country, and you're standing in front of this guy you've heard is amazing, George Washington, in this park right here. And he tells you, I'm going to get someone to read something to you. And a guy gets up, hired by Washington, and what he reads to you is the Declaration of Independence, written and signed 5 days earlier in Philadelphia. And according to stories at the time, the troops assembled in this square, modern-day City Hall Park, were so inspired by this reading of the Declaration of Independence that they stormed that way. To tear down what was once a statue of George III, which I think stood right where that fountain is. This fence was originally put up to actually protect the statue from people while trying to tear it down. It is the oldest fence in New York City, and this is the oldest public park in New York City. I hate talking in public, it's really embarrassing. This spot right here, there was a statue of George III, and it was originally erected, ironically enough, because the colonists wanted to put up a statue of William Pitt, who was an advisor to George III. William Pitt had been instrumental in repealing the Stamp Act, which we learned about last lecture. And the colonists were so grateful to William Pitt for repealing the Stamp Act that they wanted a statue put up, but it didn't seem right to put up a statue of just the king's advisor when you didn't even have a statue for the king in Lower Manhattan. So they were like, okay, we'll compromise. We'll put up a statue of George III, and then we'll put up a statue of the guy we actually like, William Pitt. So they put up those two statues right here. And then the troops went and tore them down. You know, they tore down the George III statue, but they wouldn't have torn down the William Pitt statue, but there's no William Pitt statue. That's the Wall Street Bowl over there. This spot, Bowling Green, Lower Manhattan, was the same place that George Washington would return to in 1783 when his long, difficult war against the British was finally over, because right behind me on the water, the very southern tip of Manhattan Island, the British got on their ships and sailed away for the last time, except 1812 when they came back and burned down the White House. During that war, but before 1783, in Philadelphia, the founders of the country got together and wrote the Articles of Confederation, which we talked a little bit about last week. Remember, that was like the early bad version of the Constitution. And the Articles of Confederation seemed to be going just fine until people realized that they left the central government too weak to, as you know from last week, raise taxes, raise an army, do really anything at all. These fears were really crystallized in 1786 when in Massachusetts, a guy named Daniel Shays and a group of his fellow ex-soldiers started a protest against their inability to pay the debts that they had incurred because of the Revolutionary War. They actually hadn't been paid for their service in the Revolutionary War, and so they were out of money. So in Springfield, Massachusetts, about 4,000 rebels with Daniel Shays at their head started doing classic rebel stuff. The federal government was asked to put down the rebellion, as is the federal government's job. And the federal government said, we don't have any troops to put this rebellion down with. We don't have any money to raise the troops to put the rebellion down with. We can't do anything. And this actually really scared people. Specifically, it scared people who own property and land in the New World, because they said, well, if this government can't enforce property rights, then what is it good for? What's the point? So eventually, this rebellion in Massachusetts was put down by the state of Massachusetts, not federal troops, and a privately funded militia. So the U.S. was actually so weak, they didn't have an army to put down some farmers with pitchforks and they had to privately raise a militia to go put down this rebellion. So this really scared people, and they said, okay, we have to drastically revise the Articles of Confederation. So the year after Shays' Rebellion, the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the hot summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, was how the Constitution was originally written. Remember, they came there intending to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they quickly realized that the Articles were entirely too bad to revise, and they would just have to throw them out and start with something fresh, which they would call the U.S. Constitution. Now, that one had a slightly longer run than the Articles of Confederation and is still in effect to this day. But before it could go into effect, it actually had to be ratified. Remember, there were 13 colonies at the time, now 13 states, that they'd won their big Revolutionary War. And it said in the Constitution that once the Constitution was ratified by 9 of those 13 states, then it would go into full effect. And you know from last week's discussion of the Federalist Papers that it took a while for that to happen, but finally in 1789, the 9th states ratified, the other few followed a bit later on, and from 1789 to 2020, we operate under the basic law called the U.S. Constitution. This brings up a point that a lot of people ask fairly enough, which is, what is the difference between constitutional law and just regular old law? Why have a special set of laws that are higher than all the other laws? It's a good question. So, the difference between constitutional law and regular law passed by a legislature is that the Constitution makes statutory law possible. It sets up the actual legislature and the other bodies for promulgating, passing, and enforcing laws, as well as making sure the laws are constitutional to begin with, the court system. So what does it mean then to have an unconstitutional law? It's like saying an illegal law. It doesn't make any sense. It sounds like a contradiction. The answer is luckily pretty simple. The Constitution has priority over statutory law, that is, all the laws that are passed since the Constitution. So if you go out and you try to pass or write a law that conflicts with the Constitution, then that law can be struck down by the court system as conflicting with the Constitution. And it will therefore be unconstitutional, and it will be considered null and void. So the short version of this answer is that the Constitution sets up the basic law of the land, and you cannot change it unless you do a constitutional amendment, which we'll talk about later, but suffice to say they're super hard. The Constitution has only been amended 17 times in about 240 years, and so it's not the kind of thing that happens every day. Statutory law, on the other hand, can be passed by the Congress and signed into law by the President on the federal level, or an analogous process at the state level. The New York State Assembly can pass a law, and then the governor can sign it into law. So you have statutory law at both the federal and the state level. And of course, each state in the U.S. has its own constitution. So at both the federal and the state level, you have constitutional law, and then below that, statutory law. And because of the supremacy clause in the Constitution, federal law always predominates over state law, wherever the two might conflict. That is the difference between constitutional and state law. Let's move on to lecture 2. One thing you probably already know about the political system, but if you don't, I guess you're going to learn now, is that there are political parties. Now, we take this for granted in the modern day. You have Democrats, you have Republicans, you have the Green Party, you have the Libertarian Party. The founders actually did not anticipate political parties. And indeed, they thought political parties were a serious problem, something you would not want to have in a healthy republic. But almost immediately after the Constitution was ratified, in fact, essentially before, you had people who were pro-ratification and against ratification. These eventually morphed into people who favored a strong, robust central government and people who opposed a strong, robust central government. These were called the Federalists, for those who liked federal government, and the Anti-Federalists, for those who disliked a strong federal government. The history of the party system and how the modern parties came to be is long and tangled, but today we have a two-party system primarily, in which the Democrats and the Republicans capture virtually all of the vote between the two of them, and third parties like Green or Libertarian parties play an extremely minor role in most elections, especially national elections. Now, people often complain about the two-party system, but it actually has its pros and cons like anything. Parties can do the work that voters don't have to by putting together a coherent ideological platform and putting it forward on the national stage. That way voters can choose the party that best represents their ideological views, and you kind of get some of the intellectual work lifted from you by the party system. Imagine, for example, if instead of the party system, you had to manually research all of the 185 relevant issues every single election cycle and then cast a vote for individual candidates on each issue. You would be able to more finely express your views, but it would actually be really hard, and I don't think many people would actually do it. One disadvantage of the party system, though, is sort of the other side of that same coin, which is that as the parties offer a clear choice, they also make a more nuanced choice much, much harder. That is, if you don't like the policy platforms of one of the main two parties, you are to a certain degree kind of out of luck. That is, if you don't really like what the Democrats are doing or you don't really like what the Republicans are doing, ooh, they're coming in hot there, you're going to have real problems actually expressing your more nuanced position in a two-party system because you really only have two choices. Now, one fair question you might ask is, why is a two-party system the type of system we have at all? Why not 5 parties? Why not 1 million? Why not none at all? The answer is actually pretty well described by not a question of politics, but a question of mathematics. Now, the US uses a very simple voting system. We were the first democracy since the ancient Greeks, so it's no surprise that we tried a very simple system of whichever person gets the most votes in a given election gets that seat or office that they're running for. Sounds simple, is simple, has those advantages. That's called a plurality election. Whoever gets the most votes wins the thing that they're running for. Now, this sounds easy, but one problem with a plurality election is that it leads to a mathematical incentive to have just 2 parties. That is, in a real, accurately represented field, you would have almost as many political parties as there are reasonable positions to take on an issue. You would have 12, you would have 24 on any issue, let alone any complex of issues. But if you need to gather the most possible support behind you to win the election you're trying to win, what you are actually incentivized to do is to have the broadest possible coalition and try to win as close to 50% of the vote as you can. And then, of course, your opponent party should try to do the exact same strategy. This leads to a situation where 2 parties will capture the vast majority of the vote share, and any third parties have essentially no mathematical chance of achieving a plurality of the vote. It will be very difficult for any third parties to get anywhere near 50% of the vote. They'll get 2, 3%. But in a plurality system, it doesn't matter if you get 2 or 3%. It is as good as 0. Now you might ask, isn't that how all voting systems should work? The parties are incentivized to get 50% of the vote plus 1, and so what they're going to do is essentially work toward that goal. What would be another system where getting 5% of the vote would actually be valuable, and why should we want that type of system? Well, in places like Europe, parts of Asia, it is common to use a proportional representation system rather than a plurality or winner-take-all system. In a proportional system, a party will be allocated seats in parliament, say, based on the percentage of the vote that they get. So you win 20% of the vote, you get about 20% of the seats. You win 5% of the vote, you get 5%. You win 55% of the vote, you get 55% of the seats in parliament. So your influence in Congress or parliament is proportional to the percentage of support you actually have in the population. In this system, you're actually incentivized to run a good campaign and get 5%, even if you're a less known party, because that 5% could translate into a couple of seats in parliament and some level of influence and prestige. So in a proportional system, small parties are not disincentivized from existing. And indeed, we see in European countries far more third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties, parties that are not in the dominant group. One important distinction about elections that you need to know is the difference between general and primary elections. When the parties pick who they actually want to run in the main election, they usually do this through a system called the primary. So in a primary election, the parties will actually try to decide amongst themselves the person they want to nominate for the general election. The general election is just the main election. It's what people usually think about when they hear the word election. It's the 2 parties running their nominees against each other. For a sports metaphor, you can think about the primaries as the early rounds of the playoffs, and then the general election as the actual final game. The final thing we have to talk about today is polarization. The voters of the two parties, as well as the two parties themselves, can be closer together or further apart on an ideological spectrum. That just means that one can be further left or more liberal than the other, which will be further right or more conservative. Or they could both be somewhere in the middle and they could have a lot of agreement. A high degree of polarization means the parties and their voters are very far apart. They disagree on a lot. This could mean that one party is very liberal or one party is very conservative, or they both at the same time are very liberal and very conservative, and therefore there is a huge gap between them and not a lot of agreement between them. A low level of polarization, conversely, means that the two parties are very close together and there's a lot of overlap in the views of both the parties and the voters that support the parties. Now, high polarization can be a problem because it leads to more gridlock and more conflict in political systems. Indeed, there was extremely high levels of polarization in the lead up to the American Civil War, as well as the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution. There is also historically high levels of polarization right now in U.S. politics. The Democratic and Republican parties, the left and right parties in U.S. politics, are further apart on average than they've been at basically any point since the run-up to the U.S. Civil War in the 1850s and 60s. All right, that's pretty much it. I'm going to go home and eat something. That was a review of the parties. It's Brooklyn.